I'm Scott Allen Miller, and I'm doing my reviews and commentary on the history of cinema. And the first video we're making is The Oldest Talkie. This is the first movie that we would generally be able to call a modern full talking movie. So this is a really important film from the fact that it's not the first one to ever introduce audio into a movie. It's not the first with synchronized sound. It's not the first that someone talked, but it is the first that we would generally really accept as being what we think of as a modern talking movie. And that is a movie that was known as the Broadway Melody and has since been known sometimes as the Broadway Melody of 1929. Not surprisingly, it is from 1929, and it's really important for a lot of reasons. One of the things that's interesting about it, of course, we're in the black and white era, if that's not obvious, that we have what is essentially a silent movie being filmed with full audio. So it's all actors from the silent era, it's all directors, every single thing.
Hello, Jimmy.
Looks and feels like you're in the silent era, and yet people are talking. You have that silent era makeup, you have that overdramatic acting, you have a whole bunch of it just doesn't feel natural, and yet they're talking and singing and they're doing a bunch of dance numbers and stuff. But of course, as was common in the era, they had to do a movie with all kinds of things, right? It's like a vaudeville show done as a movie. So you see this combination of traditional vaudeville and the silent movie era merged into one, because with full audio, this is the first real opportunity that they had to approach something like this. And that's really interesting. And just as a starting point, there had to be something, and I think this was a pretty good one. You can tell really quickly that the sets are 1929. You can tell that they're barely able to make the film. It's a technical extravaganza at the time. This was like special effects through the roof, simply by the fact that they could talk through everything. But the nature of doing so, there's no actors used to this, right? They're used to just miming and not mattering what they actually say, and any audio is just, you know, inner scene letters or whatever. This was very new. And so it's really interesting. It's also really interesting to see a movie that gives us that full, like, as if you're there, right? Because silent films really pull you out of the story quite a bit. And the fantasy shows and all that, it's very difficult to really place yourself. But this movie, as much as you can in a Hollywood set-based film, puts you into the world of 1929 and gives you as much of a glimpse as probably any film has from the era into just the mood and the perceptions of life before the beginning of the Great Depression. So this movie was filmed early in the year and came out still before the Great Crash. So this was a world when they're talking about poverty, they're talking about the challenges of life, the difficulties that people face trying to fund shows on Broadway and so forth. This was during the Roaring '20s. This was at the absolute peak of American opulence. The fall of the economy was soon to come, but they had no idea at the time. Only a few brilliant economists had even an inkling that such a collapse was right around the corner. It was the first really, really big one of that magnitude. There had been, of course, before that, but this was really looking at the top of a bubble that was about to burst, and so seeing how people were perceiving the amount of poverty, the struggles in life and such, is really interesting, because it's difficult to see the 1920s now, the Roaring '20s, from this perspective, because we always see it through the lens of knowing that the Great Depression was just around the corner. We see it as this really bubblish economy. Everything is just seen as so opulent, and we because of that, we tend to see the 1920s very much from a ultra-rich perspective. We tend to focus on the people who had the wealth, because that was what was interesting during the 1920s. The wealthy were incredibly wealthy, and the wealthy class was relatively large. Whereas in the 1930s, we have a tendency, because it's what's interesting, we tend to focus on the poor. In retrospect, we look at those who were most impoverished during the Great Depression, because that's what the Great Depression was about. But as we'll see in later films, people during the 1930s were obsessed with the wealthy because they needed a distraction from poverty. Whereas in the 1920s, there was a lot more affluence and they had a focus on the poor. But importantly, the amount of poverty, how rough things were in the 1920s for the poor versus the 1930s isn't as different, I don't think, as we often perceive. We have this view that the 1930s were so awful, and they were, but that the 1920s were so good. And I don't believe that that is actually the case. I think what we see from many films is that situation with poverty in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, the aughts, the 10s and the 20s was actually pretty bad. Just in general, it was not a great time period to be poor. Not that ever is great to be poor, but it was really bad during those years. And yes, in the 1930s, it became so much worse, but I think there was also many more institutions put in place to help deal with it in the 1930s because it was so much more widespread, because the collapse was so dramatic that they had to put social structures into place instead of leaving people so much to fend for themselves. Also interesting, 1929 means we were well in the middle of Prohibition, and so the idea that you could have alcohol, it's completely different, right? And so movies during the next few years that we're watching, these were all done when in America it was illegal to have alcohol. And so that's an interesting perspective, to not see movies about Prohibition, but movies during Prohibition, and seeing them through that lens of, if they're showing alcohol in America, that it is an illegal thing. So that's a perspective you have to have. If they're talking about the social structures, they're talking about the poverty, they're talking about all these things going on, crime and domestic violence, which is not in this movie, but we're going to see is a major theme during this era. Those are all without alcohol. We often blame alcohol for these things, but watching these movies gives you a completely different perspective on the things that were going on at the time, both in the 20s, super affluent era, 30s, super impoverished era, and combined you see the overlap of the 20s and early 30s without alcohol, and then the later 30s, mid 30s and later with alcohol. It's all a really interesting juxtaposition. So this movie on its own has very little to comment on, except for being such an important first, being such a silent movie with sound, to being so poorly filmed, so poorly acted, but it had to be, right? It's not an indictment of the movie. I think it's worth watching. If you're interested in cinema studies, I certainly recommend this film. This gets a thumbs up from me as a really important film that there's just no way to skip. You can't work around this film and really have a good handle on where you are in the era. This changed everything. Once people saw this film, the expectation that films were going to be full audio, I think was established, right? Before this, movies were playing around with it. They were mixing it in, and people could take it or leave it. They were interested. It was a special effect, but it wasn't, this is the answer, this is how movies have to be. But after this, we only see a handful of silent movies that still come out. Of course, City Lights being an important one, which we will get to when I have a chance to do silent movies. But with that rare exception, there's almost nothing that stands out in the silent era following this film. So this was a watershed. This is the start of cinema as we think of it in the modern era, going into the golden age. And so highly recommend it. Very interesting on its own. Pretty boring movie, a little bit difficult to watch. Definitely not for kids. Not that it's inappropriate, simply not going to hold their attention in any particular way. It was difficult for me to make it through, but I am glad that I did. And I think if you're into cinema studies that you will enjoy it. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you with the next show.